Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this conversation with Liz Gustavson and Scott Hayman and myself. Um, we are all with First Unitarian Church. I'm the minister. Liz and Scott are longtime members of the church. And we are talking today about First Unitarian Church's involvement with Interfaith Hospitality Network. We were one of the founding congregations of this effort to provide um, housing for homeless families in Worcester. From the days when families came to the church and this church and other congregations in Worcester and slept in the churches and synagogues, to now when we help support a permanent shelter on June Street. Thank you both, Scott and Liz, for doing this, being here tonight. I want to let everybody know that the reason we're doing this is to help raise money for IHN this Christmas season. We have a goal of $6,000. That's about the amount that we usually collect during our Christmas Eve donations. This year with Christmas Eve online, we're trying to do it ahead of time. And you can go to this link, firstunitarian.com, and go to Community and Service and Justice. And the IHN is the first section on that page. And there you can click a Donate Now button to give. It's a PayPal link. If you give this way, the church will pay 100% of the fees, so your entire contribution will go to support IHN. And if you're looking at this video in an email you've received, there's a link right in the email to go there. So thank you for anything that you can give. Every gift helps support our neighbors in Worcester. So thank you both for being here. Let's start back at the beginning. When did IHN begin, and how did First U become involved in founding this effort?
Well, I guess I'll start with that. So IHN was actually inspired by Mark Beckwith, who was the rector, is that right, at All Saints, and he had recently come and he got involved with the interfaith effort, which has been involved for years in trying to do good things for the community and so forth, and particularly take on tough issues and advocate and not just raise money but advocate. And so Mark Beckwith came to town, and at the time I was working for what was then called the Central Massachusetts Housing Alliance, which I was the executive director for. And so at that time, access to shelter, family shelter in particular, was very, very limited by the rules that governed both federal and state. So it was very, very difficult for many, many families to get into shelter. And if they were fortunate to get into shelter, they could not get in as an intact family. So the mom and the kids could go to a shelter, but then the husband, and often if it was an older boy, would have to go to what then was called the PIP shelter, which is a terrible name, but it was originally the public inebriate shelter. And so those are the only options for families who were, and increasingly then families were facing sort of short-term crises. They didn't necessarily fit the criteria to get into shelter in terms of, it was just like a job loss or a health problem or things like that. And so Mark Beckwith had from New Jersey, and New Jersey had already started an IHN, an Interfaith Hospitality Network. So he came to our agency and we talked about it, and there were a number of fantastic shelter providers at the time, but but there was some reluctance actually, because it's sort of like, well, will this draw from the effort to support these other shelters, or will this actually expand the pie and so forth? And it was agreed that in the end, by getting robust involvement from all the central Massachusetts churches and synagogues and congregations and so forth, that probably was a good idea, and it would actually help whole families, mom, dad, children, stay in one place together. And again, the criteria to get into family shelter was so ridiculously hard. And in fact, if you were to get into state or federal family shelter, you might be sent to Springfield, so you'd be torn away from your community, or Boston, or to a motel or hotel. So there are a lot of compelling reasons to do the program, but obviously there was a lot of concerns. So anyways, Mark and the Central Mass Housing Alliance, we went out and needed to recruit a day provider because the idea was that families would stay in churches overnight. That was the model for up to 2 weeks at a time, sometimes more, and be hosted by area congregations and so forth. But then they had to go somewhere in the day. They had jobs to get to. They had school to get to, they had showers and things like that. So the original recruit was the downtown Central YMCA, provided the day programming, and the Friendly House offered basically social services and things like that and so forth. And it was a hard slog, but basically the idea was to go out and I will always give credit to the Greater Worcester Community Foundation. They always still to this day come to the community and say what is the most, if this is what you want and that's what you're telling us, then we'll do it. So they help seed some money, and then there was a major effort to recruit congregations. And yes, the First Unitarian Church was one of the first to jump on board, which had already had a history with the Central Mass Housing Alliance because Will Sherwood and Blaine.
Our director of music and his partner, yeah.
Yes, yeah, Will Sherwood, our music director, and Blaine had already I hadn't even been a member of the church, and they had already for 10 years helped us raise upward, an average of $15,000 to $25,000 a year with a Christmas concert and a fundraising appeal. And the great deal of maybe half of the donor list was First Unitarian Church members.
Yeah, wow.
And it was so we already had a history of we always, want to do something about this kind of stuff. Also, we had the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal to actually make a huge difference. So we had a history, we were recruited, and we got on board.
And I should say the reason I've asked the two of you to have this conversation is because, Scott, you have spent your career in housing and solutions to homelessness, and were part of getting this off the ground. And Liz, you are our current coordinator right. For IHN. You help get our volunteers signed up for the 3 weeks a year that we staff the shelter and help us raise the money we donate every week that we staff. So tell us how you got involved with IHN.
Well, I think IHN got off the ground around 1997. And at that time, I think it was Susan Anderson who was the coordinator for IHN. And she did that for about 3 years. And at that point, she felt like it was time to share the wealth. And I was in a position where I was very interested, as I'd seen the families come into our church. There was a rented van that would schlep all the 17 cots and the belongings for all the families that were in bins or green garbage bags, and the belongings and the cots would come on a Sunday morning. Susan would organize a big gathering of people to move the stuff from the Bancroft room down into the Sunday school rooms. And then, so I, paid attention to that, and I thought that's something I could do. So maybe it was really, about 2000 that I started to take over. And around that same time we had the fire, right? Mm-hmm. We ended up, rather than using the Sunday school rooms when we were able to, we had the guests come and stay in our Unity Hall for a week. And they were separated. Each family was separated by kind of a cloth barrier. So that was, so actually I have been the coordinator for most of the past 20 years. There were about 3 years that Janu Noel Cost was, had taken over it, but I was still assisting her with that. So it's been really a long time commitment on my part, but it's something I just feel like it is not that hard to do, and it's really important. Scott, thank you for that kind of overview of how we got started in Worcester with IHN. As you noted, it was New Jersey in the 1980s that had started this idea of using churches as a shelter for homeless people. It was kind of a no-brainer. The church buildings themselves were not being used during the week, and if you could get volunteers to help with the, hosting and with food and support, it would seem like a very nice meshing of community support.
I think it's important to point out that now there is a massive gulf between those who have and those who do not. There was a less of a gulf, but it was beginning to grow then. And there were great concerns that federal and state funds couldn't, wasn't going to be enough and so forth. And that, in fact, during that time in Worcester, we lost manufacturing jobs, we lost major powerful home companies who got sold and then went elsewhere. And that was happening all across the nation. And, sort of left in the wake was all these local communities that had families and individuals and so forth who wanted to actually, who we needed to help, but we didn't have what were pretty robust tools before. I mean, there was a time when in Massachusetts, when if you faced homelessness, because of a lot of great work of like legal assistance attorneys and all that kind of stuff, we were leaders actually in the nation in terms of like providing the best of care. You couldn't, if you went to a shelter, they would actually pay to put your belongings in storage.
Mm.
And they would not, the donations clearinghouse started where we would go out through the community and collect furniture and household goods and beds, and pots and pans and all that kind of stuff, because it was not legal to release someone from shelter to an apartment unless they had furnishings, right? I mean, that's all gone by the wayside. But so, that still grows in terms of like, but it's amazing that communities still hang in there and do the kind of work that Liz in particular has done for the last 20 years.
And tell me if I've got this right, but it's still the case that there's, through the state system, there's emergency shelter for men, including older teenage boys, whether they're addicted or sober, whether they're using or not. There's sort of a shelter for all comers on Queen Street, right?
Right. It moved off of Main Street to Queen Street. Right.
And then there's emergency housing for women with children, women with their little children or their teenage daughters. But families fall into this gulf where if you're a mom with a 16-year-old boy, or you're a mom and a dad with kids, or you're a dad with kids and there's mom's not in the picture, or you're two dads.
Right.
There's not, the state system just doesn't serve that configuration.
Right. It does not. I mean, it did not, and that was why IHN, I think was conceived. But on top of that, I mean, the resources in total just have continued to shrink and so forth in terms of so it seems very modest, right? But as Liz said, if you're actually there on a night staying over, when it was either in the church or now where it's at the shelter, it's quite amazing to see, basically help a family, and it's huge varieties of families with difficult issues and so forth, actually have shelter for the night. Otherwise you would be split up. And talk about, there was a period of time after that where there was this whole model of housing first.
Yeah.
It's a great idea because back then also one of the flaws in the system was that it was this idea that you had to that everybody was flawed and therefore you had to go into shelter and you couldn't go into supportive housing or transitional housing. You had to go into that first before you go back out into the community, as if everybody who faced homelessness, had these serious problems. Well, many times
earn your way into housing.
Right, and that was flawed. So they thought, okay, well, we'll establish housing first and all that, and that's still a great model, but the resources aren't there to actually, So there's still a huge need for the IHN and any other types of programs where people can.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed volunteering at IHN is that the parents in these families are often working.
Yes.
They continue to work through the experience of homelessness and then being in the shelter. So these are really hardworking families trying their best to take care of their children and keep a roof over their heads, and they've just been put in an impossible situation by housing prices, by unexpected expenses, medical needs.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, and back then as well, there was enormous, hate to say it, but in Worcester in particular, but many cities like ours, there was enormous amounts of really substandard slum landlord housing.
yeah,
And there's less so now, but still, but so even getting housing was not
yeah,
necessarily, so basically it's a, IHN times 10 is what we need in
yeah,
terms of
right.
actually.
Liz, what were you going to say?
When I was staying over in October, on a night, I talked with the day staff as you do a little transition, you get a kind of report. And she said she was so happy to report that at that moment, there were 5 families in the program, and every one of them had a working parent. So some of them were working until midnight. Some of them were leaving the house at 5 in the morning, and one of the good things about IHN is that they have been willing to be flexible, rather than saying, the rule is 6 o'clock curfew, and if you're not there by 6:05, you're kicked out. So there's been a lot of accommodations to the different situations that people are in.
Yeah, yeah. So, and Liz, maybe you can speak about this. In the 2000s, the fire marshal advised congregations that it would be better if they didn't actually do the housing. So, can you talk a little about the transition to the shelter on June Street?
Yes, I think it was around 2007 that IHN got a message from the state fire marshal kind of scolding churches who were taking in homeless people who did not have a sprinkler system installed. And they were just truly concerned for the well-being of people, that if a fire happened to happen, they would not want to have any loss of life. But for many churches, it's like $100,000 to do a sprinkler system, and it was prohibitive. The cost was prohibitive to have that happen on behalf of homeless families. And so that was the beginning of the idea of trying to move from this idea of changing churches every week or two, to having a static site. It took a long time to do that, but it was about 7 years ago that the house at 91 June Street was purchased after kind of a major capital campaign. And it took maybe a year to get it retrofitted with handicapped ramps and ADA accommodations and the sprinkler system. And I think they've been in the house for about 6 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And the house at 91 June Street does accommodate 6 families. There are 6 bedrooms. Each family gets a bedroom. Some bedrooms are small. There's one that's quite large. It had family of 7 there for a long time. So that's been truly a blessing. That is the message we get from so many families that I've talked to. That is, they feel blessed to be there. What was I going to say? At one point, I was working as a counselor for Fallon, and there was a medical assistant who was working at Fallon, who was a resident at IHN. So, just regular folks can have their lives be upended, and they need this kind of support.
Yeah, and of course, at that time also it was exciting because various churches were asked to sponsor renovating one, or not gut rehab, but like basically improving 1 or 2 of the rooms or whatever. So we had a great time actually doing 2 of the rooms. It was a children's playroom and so forth, and a couple members, well, my daughter, but also several others, and we got to go up and paint, and we made a beautiful space.
Yeah.
Two beautiful spaces, and it was that's really rewarding, actually.
I find volunteering at IHN to be rewarding. I try to do an evening shift when it's our week, and now, of course, with coronavirus, it's different. If anybody's watching this and thinking about volunteering, I want to say it's very safe during COVID. Um, it's fun under normal circumstances to socialize with the family, but now the volunteer doesn't need to do that for everybody's safety. You have your own space, and you're just there in case of an emergency. Uh, and volunteering allows the shelter to stay open, so it's an important thing to do. But under normal circumstances, it's really enjoyable. You get to meet the families, you eat dinner with them. I usually play with the kids. Sometimes I bring my own kids with me, or one of them, and they play with the kids who are there. It's the word that comes to my mind is dignified. That the housing is dignified, and it gives these families dignity when they're going through a really hard time in their lives.
Absolutely.
So if you're out there, First Unitarians, and Liz Gustavson comes to you and says, "Hey, do you want to sign up during our week?" I encourage you to say yes. You can do an evening or an overnight, and it's fun.
Right. I'm always willing to do a training, and the day staff at IHN is also willing to train people. So you're not left totally shocked and alone over there.
Right.
But as Sarah said, it's safe, and it is, doing good work. If you can't give, I always kind of feel like if you can't give money, then you can perhaps you can volunteer, or vice versa. So one of the things I've done at church is to kind of rustle up money sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, selling your cinnamon buns.
Right.
Cinnamon buns for years.
And that's still, members of Worcester congregations still provide that evening and overnight presence, which is required for a shelter, as I understand it. That there needs to be a responsible party there all the time. And so volunteers make that happen. We're still, the religious community of Worcester is still very much involved in keeping IHN a going concern.
Right. There's over 25 congregations, synagogues, Protestant churches, Catholic churches, all working together. And they are looking for additional congregations to join in, because there's a number of weeks that have been unaccounted for. And so the standing congregations who already volunteer, for example, we donate 3 weeks a year.
Yep.
Where I'll coordinate the volunteers and I have been doing the fundraising to pay for about $300 worth of groceries or supplies each week that we do cover. But sometimes those untended weeks need assistance, and so the director, Michelle Beaver, currently will send out an appeal asking for people who have volunteered to consider coming in and helping out. So, for example, this is Tuesday night, and I'll be sleeping over on Friday night because this is one of those weeks that they needed some additional help.
Yeah. This might be a question for you, Scott. What do you think is the biggest problem facing housing insecure families right now?
Well, the housing market, believe it or not, Worcester is like rents are rising.
I do believe
it. For years and years, Worcester's rents would be relatively flatlined. But since the crisis in 2008, the mortgage crisis, foreclosure crisis, 8 and 9 and so forth, there's more renters, more demand, and there's less people able to buy their own homes. And now, even currently with COVID, because of the extremely low interest rates, people are buying homes or whatever. But so rents, which were relatively stable for years now, are quite expensive. After that, obviously with COVID, but prior to that, COVID is just sort of I see it more like a symptom. Basically, for years now, there's been the goal for the gap for, middle income or lower middle income people is just ever widening in terms of, a single, and then, with changes in household dynamics and things like that, lack of employment, lack of permanent employment with benefits and things like that, people working 2-3 jobs. Like there's just this sort of never ending, there's a whole group of people left out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And, you know, I think everybody knows it, but what do we do about it? You know what I mean? It's very difficult stuff, but it's very, very real. And so, you know, so when you're already facing it, and then basically one or another things, particularly now with COVID, takes place and you have a job loss and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's inevitable that people are going to be losing their housing.
Yeah.
And going along with that is when the program started in the 90s, people would come in and it would take 4 to 6 weeks for them to find an apartment. And now it's more like a year to find an apartment.
Right.
Between saving that much more money because the apartment rents have gone up so much from the 90s to finding someplace.
And, you know, you need,
It's quite a challenge.
there's so many, it's incredible, but you need first, last, and security often. That's a huge amount of money when rents are, you know, and that's usually whatever the monthly rent is times, you know, 2 more times. And, you know, it's very, very difficult. And I would like to say, I feel like there's a great end in sight and all that kind of stuff, but basically federal resources for the last 20, 30, 40 years have declined. I mean, when I was running the Central Mass Housing Alliance, basically, as Liz mentioned, you know, people would move into shelter and they might be there for 3 months, 4 months, but then they would go out to a beautiful brand new apartment with a Section 8 subsidy and just fit back into the society and be very, very happy and all that kind of stuff. And that was interestingly when, you know, countless times I can remember bringing an entire household of an entire set of goods to a household, like a bed, 3 beds, dressers, kitchen tables, dishes, you name it, to a woman. You know, you knock on the door and they would open it, and basically we'd move in all of their furniture and all that kind of stuff. They'd been homeless for 4 or 5 months and they could start, otherwise they were moving into an empty apartment. So what I'm trying to say though is there were apartments more available and subsidies more available for people to actually move into. And that's just not the case anymore.
Yeah.
And, you know, a variety of reasons for that. But, you know, there needs to be a lot of federal and state support as well as community support for folks and things like that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be downer, but it's crazy how the gap is huge, you know, and I don't think people realize it, but it's huge. And you know, every city wants to do better, and Worcester wants to do better. So we want to have a great, robust housing market, and that's all great. That's fine. If you have the accompanying federal and state subsidies go along so that you can still have higher rents so you can support landlords and pay rents and mortgages, that's great. But if people have a subsidy so they can come in and enjoy the same wealth, great. But without it, man.
Yeah, and so people of different income levels can live in the same neighborhoods, which I think is important too.
Right.
So that you don't have, if poverty gets too concentrated in any one neighborhood, it makes life harder in those neighborhoods. Whereas if you know, the housing, I'm pointing here out my window in my office, the
courthouse next door,
that's going to be a mix of market rate and workforce housing.
Right.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah, they're taking their signs say they're going to open soon. I think you can look at their website now, see their apartments.
Yeah. So I mean so more and more of that, and it works, and it's happened all throughout Worcester, and it's a little bit unsung, and then there's politics and and sort of rhetoric or whatever. It should all be ignored. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that actually works, that builds and creates and cements a community for the long haul.
Yeah, and benefits the city as a whole by creating a stable families and a well-supported workforce of people who are healthy and can and can go to their jobs and take care of their children, raise the next generation of citizens.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
all that stuff.
One of the things I learned from one of our members a while back was Heather Soiree Packard. She had been working for Heifer Project for a long time, and she taught me that there's a difference between relief and development. So what IHN is doing is providing relief for a number of families, but the courthouse and the work that Scott has been doing has been providing development. And then the people who are working on the broader scale of trying to bring, employment and that understanding, Sarah, you were just saying about sort of like justice, about equity with housing availability is another piece of the umbrella that is so important to be done. So we need to do the relief immediately that we can, physically hands-on stuff with IHN, and then people with vision and energy to do the development to make a difference is all important.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, that was one of the inspirations for IHM, was that perhaps you could kind of close this gulf by actually all of our members and the Catholic Church's members and the synagogue's members getting firsthand experience with people. These families are not demons. They are not.
Right.
These families are just exactly like us and in great need of some help, often one time or two times, but and that's all it is. But there was, I remember, the contract for America, Newt Gingrich in 1995, all that kind of stuff, and it was like sort of, before that, it was just sort of like, you cut this, cut that, and usually with a lot of like demonizing and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's a shame. There's no need for it. I mean, Liz, myself, I can firsthand testify. These families,
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, these families who come through
shelters are just like us.
Yeah.
They just don't have a safety net, and something fell through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sven knows too.
So, Liz, you mentioned that when we volunteer, we donate $300 a week for each week that we volunteer, and that's when you sell your cinnamon rolls, and people in coffee hour donate money. But what we are trying to do right now with our Christmas donation is something more than that. We are trying to make a substantial donation to the operating budget of IHN to help support the expenses on the house, their professional staff, and their programming for the families that live in the shelter. And that's important because it's a family shelter and it's outside of the state system, and it doesn't participate in the state funding that the other homeless shelters in Worcester are part of, the Queen Street shelter and emergency housing. Is IHN entirely supported through private grants and donations?
I'm not sure. There's the fiscal agent for IHN continues to be Friendly House.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure of all the
Right.
places that.
But I know that the donations they get, this is a key component of their
absolutely
operating budget, and they're counting on us. We've been giving them our Christmas Eve donation for many years. Some of you watching may know that we give a little bit of money to support a student in Tibet, and we are going to do that this year as well. The Minister's Discretionary Fund is going to make that donation. But this big donation to IHN is an opportunity for all of us to help support these families. Volunteering might be something you could do, or giving might be something you could do, or both. Yeah. So any last thoughts?
Thank you for doing this, Sarah.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you both for doing this. This was fun. I learned a lot.
Grateful. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk a little bit.
You're welcome. I hope everybody enjoys it. Okay. And folks watching at home, I just want to remind you one more time, you can go to this link, firstunitarian.com/community/service and justice. If you just scroll down to the first entry on that page, it's IHN. If you click the link in the email with this video, it'll take you right there. There's a donate button. Those donations, 100% of your gift will go to IHN, and we'll pay the fees. So you can also, if you prefer, you can send a check made out to First Unitarian Church and send it to 90 Main Street, Worcester, Massachusetts 01608, and put IHN in the memo line, and that donation will get to them as well. I thank you all for considering a gift. Thank you for those of you who have donated or are donating now, and thank you, Liz and Scott, for doing this.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Bye.